Okay, buckle your seatbelts. I'm going to geek out on you for a minute here. I have been reading the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series with my son, Daniel, and we just read this one part that made me think of Yom Kippur. Bear with me. So Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent are adventuring through the galaxy and find themselves marooned on Earth 2 days before it's scheduled to be blown up to make way for a space bypass. They need to get off the planet, but to do that, they have to find a ship where they can catch a ride. Luckily for them, Ford, who is an experienced space traveler, knows what to look for, and pretty soon he gets excited and says to Arthur, "Hey, I think there's an SEP force field over there." A what? An SEP. It's something we can't see or don't see, or our brain doesn't let us see because we think it's somebody else's problem. That's what SEP means. Somebody else's problem. The brain just edits it out. It's like a blind spot. If you look at it directly, you won't see it unless you know precisely what it is. Well, it turns out that underneath that SEP field was a spaceship hiding in plain sight. Lucky for Ford and Arthur, they had learned how to defeat an SEP field, to train their brains to see something even if it was radiating signals that made most human brains ignore what was right in front of them, because it seemed to be somebody else's problem. See why I thought of Yom Kippur now? If you don't worry, it'll connect, I promise. That SEP field relied on something very deep within human nature. The ability that we have to imagine ourselves to be disconnected from one another, free from responsibility to and for one another. It goes back about as far as it could go. Genesis 4:9. "Am I my brother's keeper?" asked Cain, the murderer, sarcastically. The answer, though it is never stated explicitly, is yes. Yes, Cain, you are and always were your brother's keeper. And your sin began when you forgot it. Unfortunately, Cain was not alone in his mistake. American culture has long trained us to think that we are not our brother's keepers. The intellectual model goes back to the political philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries, at least that far. I'm thinking of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Darwin. To this day, many of us carry their assumptions about humanity and society without even realizing it. So what are these assumptions? In broad strokes, human history, and maybe the story of all living creatures, is a story of scarcity, competition, aggression, and violent conflict. Man's original state, and I say man's because it was men writing of men, and I think that's important. Man's original state was a state of solitary independence. Society began as a kind of mutual protection mafia. Government came along and demanded that men give up some of their original unlimited freedoms for the sake of security. Society and government are therefore in tension with freedom and should be minimized as much as possible. Mutual dependence is a kind of unnatural weakness. The connections we form with other humans are based solely on benefit to ourselves. These ideas, they're still alive in our culture and society today. Think about it. Our mythical hero is the self-made man. Our treasured patriotic value is personal freedom. We structure business and education and politics and our legal system around a model of competition between individuals acting out of self-interest. National movements yearn for the good old days when government was small and men were freer and no one expected a handout from anyone else. As a mom and a 21st century feminist, I wonder about this fantastical state of nature, free of mutual dependence. It reminds me of the creation myths of so many patriarchal cultures, including our own, in which the first human being is born not as a baby, but as a fully formed adult. No nurturing required, no childhood, and certainly no reflection of the lived experience of any other single human being on our planet. I would like to remind those 18th century philosophers that each and every one of us, every single human being over the age of 5 or 6, is here today as a result of surviving many years of complete and utter dependency. Neither the Lone Ranger nor the rugged heroes of the Wild West nor a single successful entrepreneur started out as independent adults. Every one of them started out too weak to hold up his own head. None of us were born foraging for food in the wild, hunting and gathering and fighting over scarce resources. And where do you think those proverbial bootstraps came from? No one got to pull himself up until after his mama or some other caretaker fed him and kept him alive and safe and put those bootstraps on his feet in the first place. The force which makes human beings survive to bring forth another generation is not just the brute strength and competitive instinct, it's love. And there's more. Our dependency does not end at the edge of childhood. All of our lives, we survive only because of the connections that we have to other living beings. I'm talking about the farmers who grow our food, the construction workers who build our homes, the laborers who make our clothes. I'm talking about the oxygen that sustains us breath by breath and comes from the vegetation of the earth. The state of nature is a state of interdependency. The myth of the self-made man is a fantasy that ignores fundamental aspects of the human condition. There is no rugged individual in a state of natural, unfettered freedom, unconnected to other people, owing them nothing, free from moral obligation. This is a false understanding of who we are. But there is another way to think about it. I'd say it's the Jewish way. Reconstructionist thinker Ronald Reagan writes, if modernity has taught us to say I, Judaism still asks us to say we. One of the times that Judaism asks us to say we, quite literally, is during the confessional prayers of Yom Kippur, which we're about to encounter. Many ask, how can we say honestly, Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, we have sinned, we have been untruthful, we have stolen? Why should I say in my prayers, we have stolen, I have not stolen? What do I mean when I say it? Praying in the collective voice, confessing together, is a kind of training. A reminder that responsibility extends beyond one's individual sins and good deeds. We humans, we Jews, we Americans do things collectively. Our social systems, our ecology, our biology bind us to one another in ways we are only beginning to understand. My behavior impacts all living things, my choices. And though the whole world does not rest on my shoulders alone, it does rest on the shoulders of all of us together. In the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in a free society, only some are guilty, but all are responsible. I've been thinking a lot about that teaching this year and wondering what would it mean for me to take responsibility for my part in the collective sins of my people. To what extent is it appropriate, important, or even possible for me to repent for the sins of the United States, the state of Israel, the Jewish people, or even humanity? What could that mean in terms of my own actions and choices? Well, one thing it definitely would mean would be learning to see past that SEP field, to see that problems from the human suffering in Gaza to the affordable housing crisis in our city, from the spread of hate and disinformation to the destruction of rainforests and lands far away, none of it is just somebody else's problem that I can feel free to ignore. I may not have the power to change these things all by myself. I may need to pace myself, but as my brother's keeper, I have an obligation not to look away. Sometimes it's just not possible to pretend everything is someone else's problem. Sometimes the problems are too immediate and proximate to ignore. In those times when we have the strength and capacity to take care of others, it can be the most fulfilling and meaningful experience of our lives. Last week, after Rosh Hashanah services, I called my friend Sonia. She and I have been close since we were roommates in college years ago. I was worried about Sonia because she lives in Asheville, North Carolina, and works as the executive director of the retreat center Southern Dharma up in the mountains outside the city. We'd been texting for a few days, and though she said she was safe, she had mentioned that they didn't have water, so I was worried. I called her after services to see how her Rosh Hashanah had been in Asheville, and her story was incredible. She described days of constant sirens, a swollen river crashing shipping containers into buildings, toxic sludge from a plastic factory burning into people's skin and leaking into the water. The day I called, people had begun to emerge from remote areas with traumatizing stories of climbing trees and watching waters carry away their families one by one. Somehow, the retreat center had mostly been spared. And suddenly, they found themselves in a position to help. As a center with an organized staff and supplies, they began to canvass the local area, checking on neighbors, bringing water and food. 2 days in, the roads were restored, and the retreat center began to run supplies down to the city. Sonia ended up setting up a distribution center right out of her own backyard, and it grew day by day exponentially as she reached out to the retreat center's network. For a few days, people drove in food and water and supplies and cash until it became too much to handle, and now they're just asking for donations online. So you may have been wondering why Southern Dharma was on our disaster relief list that we sent out a few days ago to tzedakah options for this season. That is why. Because they find themselves in the middle of catastrophe, positioned to help. And I know they will make good use of the money because my friend Sonia is in charge. And I trust her to be her brother's keeper right now. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that in time she may well say this was the most meaningful chapter of her life. When Judaism asks us to say we, it's not just about obligation and duty and selflessness. It's about finding deep purpose and realizing that while the problems are overwhelming when we face them, we do not have to face them alone. We are not alone, and we never need to be. Just showing up today, we are all part of something beyond ourselves. Whatever brought you here, whatever religious beliefs or background you may have, however marginal or central Judaism may be in your life, you here now are part of something magnificent. You are part of a we. People gathering for the sake of being better, reaching for the best in ourselves, trying however clumsily to forgive and to admit our imperfections. It is a task so monumental that it spans generations and continents, so frightening that we cannot do it alone. We need each other in order to succeed. And that need is not our weakness, but our strength. Over the ages, our ancestors have bequeathed to us a treasury of tools, words, melodies, rituals, a calendar of sacred time, forms that teach us how. We can turn away from selfishness and greed, violence and apathy. We can return to love and compassion. We can heal what is broken within and between us and build a better society. Being together right now, all of us are part of this grand project. We're here because no matter how cynical, how wounded, some part within maintains a flame of hope that transformation is possible. And some intuition or tradition or sense of duty urges us to seek it in the company of others. We need each other to reveal the best in ourselves. May our gathering strengthen us in the work we must do, in the changes we must make. May we find inspiration and support through being part of something bigger than ourselves. May we experience the fulfillment of giving and caring and connecting to our fellow human beings, and may this be the year in which our families, our communities, our nation, and our world come to live in a way that manifests the love that is between us, that was there from the beginning, which is why we all made it here in the first place. Ken Yehi Ratzon.